Hello everybody, this is Refresh and I am here to take a look at the Wild Bounty Brawl deck for Magic the Gathering. The back says Brawl is an exciting multiplayer format in which each deck is built around a powerful legendary creature or planeswalker. This particular deck, Wild Bounty, says Chulane's magical storytelling conveys secret wisdom to all who hear it. Gather an audience of creatures and get tons of value from Chulane's abilities, then send them forth to overwhelm your opponent. Contents include a 60-card Brawl deck, Life Wheel, Deck Box, and Informational Insert. Let's go ahead and check those contents out. Here's our Informational Insert. There are some instructions for Brawl's rules and tips. On the back there's information about all the decks, although you already bought a deck, so it's kind of weird to have more information about the decks here. I would prefer having deck lists here. And then here is our deck. Here's Chulane, Teller of Tales. For 2 green, white, blue, you get a legendary creature, Human Druid, with Vigilance, and whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. For 3, tap, return target creature you control to its owner's hands, and he is a 2/4. So this is a creature that apparently has a bit of value and ramp available to it. I imagine that its creatures will have entered the battlefield effects. Here's the deck box, with a picture of Chulane right from here on it. Look at those eyes. Inside we have a spacer. Here is a card divider and our life counter, or life wheel as they call it. And here's our deck. There is the deck. I'll play it against its peers and I'll be back to let you know what I think. So I had a chance to play with this deck a bit and here are my thoughts. The first thing that we have to look at is Chulane, Teller of Tales. Chulane has a very simple ability and is only really trying to do one thing, and that is ramp like crazy. His ability is whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card, and then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And so this deck obviously wants to cast a lot of creature spells, and you can see that there are a ton of creature spells in this deck. There's a lot less in the way of non-creature spells. And the reason why that is because whenever you cast a creature spell, after you have Chulane, you can draw a card and then ramp. And the goal is, like a lot of Elves decks, is to get to your big creatures, which are your game finishers, as soon as you can. So Chulane himself is 5 mana, and so one of the things that you're going to try to do is land one of your ramp cards early, whether it's the Arcane Signet that's in everything, or one of your many mana dorks, which you can tap to add 1 or sometimes 2 mana, and get to Chulane out, and then start casting more creatures, which some of which have some utility, but a lot of them are just pure rampers that you can use to hopefully draw more cards while Chulane is out on the battlefield, and then eventually draw into one of your finishers, which is likely going to be a Thorn Mammoth or maybe an Enraged Forerunners, which has a overrun effect stable to it, so you can make all of your little mana dorks into actual threats and then just try to smash your opponent while you're at it. And so that is the base idea of what Chulane is trying to do. He also has a second ability which has 3 tap, return target creature you control to its owner's hand, and that is so that you can return some of these cheaper creatures and abuse the top effect, so that lets you draw another card and ramp another land. So I'm thinking that's what the primary ability of this is. However, you can also use this ability to reuse enter the battlefield effects, but the deck doesn't actually have that many of them. It has a Risen Reef, a Crawl Harpooner, but that's probably going to die the first time that its effect gets used, and a Forbidding Spirit as the main enter the battlefield effects that you're interested in abusing. I guess Thorn Mammoth too, but that's an expensive card, so less likely to be reusing that, as well as the Meteor Golem. So there are a small number of enter the battlefield effects that you're trying to use, but for the most part, you're really just trying to ramp as fast as you can into one of the biggest creatures you have. So Thorn Mammoths, Enraged Forerunners. Steelbane Hydra can be pretty good too. and then you can have a big beanstalk giant, but that's going to be less useful. So how does the deck support this? Well, the deck is fairly redundant. There's a lot of ramp here. There are ways to ramp with lands like Growth Spiral, and ways to ramp with creatures, which there are a significant number of mana dorks in this deck. It does mean that early on in the game, you are actually kind of vulnerable, because if you can't land your ramp spells and get Chulane out and then get to one of your big creatures, you're going to be getting smashed a lot, because these creatures are not very well suited to blocking. And so this is going to be an issue with this particular deck, but hopefully the idea is that you can ramp, because there's so many ramp cards in here, you can get as fast as you can to one of your more credible threats. There are other credible threats that can make use of the mana that you generate. For example, the Fairy Formation is a 5/4 flyer, which is decent for 5. And then for every 4 mana, you can create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying and draw a card. And so that just lets you draw more cards, so that's good. And then you also have a Fairy Vandal early on, which gets a +1/+1 counter every time you draw your second card a turn. And Chulane, obviously, when you cast creature spells, basically gives you that second card a turn. So that is one other way to grow a little bigger. Between that and then, though, there's not a lot in the way of defensive capacity for this deck. And so you're looking at using a Prison Realm as a removal spell. You have Runaway Together as like a bounce spell that lets you also bounce one of your own creatures and then recast like with Chulane. So that's an interesting choice here. And then outside of that, you're looking at Time Wipe as your single whole board removal spell. And you also have a Field Mystic, which does happen to have a body attached to a counterspell. But, you know, counterspells are a little iffy, especially with a deck that isn't really that controlling. You're trying to ramp as fast as possible. And so I think Chulane has the capacity to get run over, and in my testing he's gotten run over multiple times. But he also has the capacity, if you just draw your cards in the right order, which is a general issue with ramp decks, then you can just go off and play one of your big creatures and just smash a lot. And so that is the deck. I think there are a few issues with the deck that I would like to see fixed. First of all is the Parhelion 2. This is not a creature spell. It is a very powerful card, and it's, you know, really strong if you can ramp to it, but it's not a creature spell. And so it doesn't quite work with Chulane the way that you would want one of these larger cards to work with. It is a little less synergistic with Chulane than, you know, to pick some other big creature spell that also has a game-breaking effect on it. And I think that would have been just better. You know, I'm not saying put a Crowworm in here, but something better would be good. Tome of Legends is also kind of a weaker choice here. This is the deck's card draw means, and what it does is it has these page counters on it. Whenever Chulane would enter the battlefield, it gets a counter, and you can spend 1 and remove a counter to draw a card. But the only other way, aside from Chulane entering the battlefield, is when you attack. And Chulane is not a good attacker. As a 2/4 body, yes, he has vigilance, so you could attack into like an empty board, but as soon as your opponents have more than one creature out, you're not really looking to attack with Chulane. So Tome of Legends as a card is a little bit weak for this particular deck. If Chulane had Invasion of some sort, then we would be talking, but because he doesn't, it's not as good of a card draw spell for this deck. Fortunately, Chulane himself is a fairly good card draw engine. I think the other main weakness with this deck is going to be the mana base. So there are a lot of basic lands. There's 15 basic lands, and then you have a stack of non-basic lands, of which you have the expected 3 Guild Gates and 3 Gain lands, which are, you know, they're fine. I mean, it's better than basics because at least it covers both, but they come in tapped, which is a bit on the weak side. The one tap land here that is more useful here is the Temple of Mystery, which lets you scry as it enters the battlefield, so that's better as a tap land. But the Hallowed Fountain and the Command Tower are probably the 2 best lands in this particular deck, and it's a deck that really just needs more. Like, I would fill out the other 2 temples and all the shock lands that match the colors, and then remove some of these basic lands, and possibly also look into maybe removing some of these tap lands for something else, because tap lands early on, like, they're fine on turn 1 with this deck because you're not really playing much on turn 1, but later on it just hurts your tempo so badly that I would just drop the Guild Gates possibly, you know, and maybe the District Guide here, and then look to replace this. And then I would also try to find other cards in this deck that have more enter the battlefield effects rather than just pure ramp, because some of these cards don't really have that much synergy with what Chulane here is doing. For one example is Kraul Harpooner. Yes, it's a creature, and it is kind of like a flying and removal on a body, but you have white and blue as well as green, and I think that there's got to be some other better removal cards that you can pick on a body that can keep you alive for a bit. The One way that your deck is trying to keep you alive is a Forbidding Spirit. That is a good one to bounce and reuse because it makes it expensive for your opponent to attack you, so that can keep you alive a bit longer. But I think those are some of the places where this deck can improve. And that's basically it for Chulane. I think Chulane is fairly straightforward and is one of the less exciting decks that you can play as a result. It's just like you get value for doing the thing that you want to do anyways in a ramp deck with a bit of top end. It can be fun. Enraged Forerunners, fun. You just like wipe out your opponents. The Thorn Mammoths can just bash a lot of your opponent's creatures down and then eventually get there, but it does have to fight, so I would expect that it's only really killing one creature at a time. The Steelbane Hydra can wipe out your opponent's enchantments and their artifacts by removing counters, and then if you want, you can bounce that and put a whole bunch more counters on it, which is also good too. And Meteor Golem can destroy one thing, so that's like your other removal spell. But I would have hoped that this deck would have one more board wipe of some sort, so that's something that you want to keep an eye out for upgrading this deck, in addition to fixing the lands and maybe trying to find a little bit more variety in the creature types and what they do when they enter the battlefield, so that you can abuse some of these recast triggers that Chulane has going on here. But that is my thoughts for the deck. In addition to everything else, you have your deck box here, which is cheap cardboard, but it's fine. And then this is, I think, only used to keep Chulane apart from the rest of the deck, and that's also just fine. The life counter is nice in the sense that it does count all the way up to 40, but this fact that you have to like flip it over in order to get the other 20 is kind of annoying, and I kind of wish that the numbers here went a little bit higher in case you want to use it for commander or gain like a significant amount of life. But that is all I have to say about that. I think that this deck is fine. I think it's very single-minded, but it does what it wants to do for the most part well, and I think that it could just use a little bit of improvement in certain card choices as well as the mana base. Let me know what your thoughts were with this deck if you had a chance to play with it. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you can hit subscribe. This was Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.